And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. I'm Stephen Grootes. Thank you for joining us on The Money Show. With still so much attention, not to what's happening here in South Africa, but what's really happening on international markets and the battle for AI. That was the big focus of the show last night. And of course, as we were leaving, it was clear Nvidia were going to lose a huge amount of value. And so it proved. They were down 17% on the day. They lost over $500 billion worth in value. If you look at what happened yesterday in terms of tech stocks in the US, they lost altogether $1 trillion. It is unbelievable. There still seems to also be more consequences as people start to think through and rebase their assumption. The assumption, as you know, always was that the United States would really lead China when it came to artificial intelligence. That was, you could call it assumption A. Assumption B was that you'd need a huge amount of electricity to power the microchips while the models, the AI models, were being trained. You've got to train them not to hallucinate, if you know what I mean. And what we saw, of course, is that the chips that we use to do this don't require that amount of electricity. And as a result, certain shares in certain power companies in the US lost significant value as well. The point I'm trying to make is that would not have been immediately obvious to most investors. It's going to take a little while for the real consequences of this all to play out. And of course, I suspect more information about how the Chinese startup did it, and I suspect more questions coming from the US as well will start to come through too, but that's going to be driving markets. Quite a lot going on in some of our retailers. That we've had more updates from ShopRite. They say Checkers sales were up very strongly during the period. Checkers 60 last year, their sales were the 60-60, that's the delivery, up 47%. We spoke last week to the CEO at Zilzi, and he sort of told us, and I had to drag it out of him a little bit. Didn't have to hold him down, but didn't want to focus on it too much. I don't blame him on how Zilzi helped the 60-60 app get going, provided some of the sort of backroom stuff, the AI, if you like. But still, there seems to be no end in sight to the Checkers 60-60 app, up 47% in terms of sales. What I don't yet see are competitors who are able to really compete. And I mean, Woolworths saying today that Woolworths Dashes, their sales are up dramatically. But it's almost a bit like, grabbing a Coke, which has become a synonym for so many things. You just almost expect the sort of blue motorcycle if you're expecting a supermarket to deliver food to you. It shows you how much work still needs to be done. And then medical aids, and I know medical aids, I was talking to someone last week who was telling me how important a medical aid had been to someone in her family just because, would not have been able to afford the life-saving medical treatment at all. If you suffer something that's sort of calamitous, if you suffer a stroke or a heart attack and you don't have medical aid and you want private health care, you're probably going to have to sell your house. That's the amount of money we're talking about. That's what medical aid is supposed to smooth through. At the same time, I know so many people who are so frustrated, angry, feel they've been ripped off by their medical aids. The battle, of course, at the moment is around lower cost products. And the claim, as I understand it, from the Board of Healthcare Funders, is they're basically saying the Council for Medical Schemes, the regulator here, is preventing lower cost options from coming to the market and doing so with an almost political intent because of the NHI. It's a bit more technical than that, and I suspect we'll hear a bit more when we hear from the industry a little later in the program. But I don't know, would you recommend medical aid to someone who maybe doesn't have a huge amount of money? On the other hand, if you know that, for example, a broken arm is going to be cared for, well, it's worth it, isn't it? Absolutely it is. That's why so many people who can have medical aid do. We'll take your calls tonight, 011 883 0702, 021 446 0567 and 072 702 1702. We'll talk to Herschel Javits, a person who knows a thing or two about house prices in a moment. Seems to be suggesting that, in fact, there will be some growth in house prices. We'll ask about Gauteng, which is where the real sort of lack of the weaker demand has been. I don't know if you've bought or sold a house in Gauteng recently. How have you found that market? Some people tell me actually quite difficult to find a house at the moment. I was surprised to hear that. Your views. Good to hear from you on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
And DSTV channel 856.
Well, confirmation now that Transnet finally able to get some South African-made locomotives running. No longer needs spares made in China for all the locomotives that were made there. The China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation has for years refused to supply the spares. SARS has claimed that that company owes it billions of rand for work done during the state capture era. Other agencies say it was involved in corruption during that time. As a result, it's been very difficult to move coal along the North Corridor railway line. That's had a huge impact on mining companies in particular, but the logistics sector in general. Professor Jan Havenga is a logistics professor at the University of Stellenbosch and a director of the GAIN Group. Professor, good evening. Glad to have you on the Money Show. Thank you. 90 locomotives should be running on this corridor in the next 15 months. Is that going to make a material difference to the amount of material transported on this route?
It will most definitely make a material difference. It is great news. I think when Russell talks about getting it up to 60 million tons now, which is quite a bit more than where we are now, so about 8 million tons more, that is significant. But it's significant for more reasons that's not always so apparent. It solves a large part, well, I would say maybe 10 to 20% of the problem of why we've had this falling volumes in coal. But it does some other interesting things. It removes an alibi. Now, if I say alibi, I primarily refer to the previous management. I would think, and I think that Transnet Engineering, whose hand I can see in this, I've been working on solutions for quite a few years now. But the previous management liked the idea of having this locomotive alibi and allowed other things to slip. It was very clear to me at the time. If you were a careful observer, you could see it. The current management is not like that. They are engaging with industry, they're engaging with everybody, they're trying to address all of the problems. But I'm just glad that we can get this solved, we get this alibi out of the way if we get going. That's fantastic news. There's some other interesting aspects to it. I saw the name of Alstom. Now, Alstom is a wonderful good news story for South Africa for many reasons, not only for this contract. I don't know to what extent people are aware of the 600 suburban trains that's being built at Nigel by a subsidiary. It's not really a subsidiary, but it's a joint venture between Alstom and a Black Economic Empowerment company. I've been to their factory twice, and they're building the most fantastic trains. 250 of them has been delivered to Praza, 150 has been deployed into service. I personally traveled on a few of them. They're marvelous. And this could make South Africa, it should make South Africa the train production hub for Africa. I know that Africa Union has actually told us that is what we should be. And if you think about the success we had with our OEMs and our car manufacturing industry, for me, when I heard this and when I saw this over the last year in terms of Alstom, and then when I heard that Alstom was involved in this, I thought, this is another really good part of this story. This is a wonderful part of the story.
How much more needs to go right to make that happen, Prof? I mean, clearly we need to keep moving. There's a long way still to go, and this is a complex industry. I mean, locomotives are complex machines.
You're absolutely right, but I think I have faith that Transnet Engineering can keep them on track. I have faith in the new management that they basically really know what they're doing. There's been huge improvements there. The problems that we're going to sit with now is probably not be technical, but it's the reform process that needs to get going. Now, that's also a positive story because our new minister has been doing her bit. The 6 months since she's taken over office, she's done some wonderful work as far as that is concerned. She's got the network statement sorted. She got the tariffs on the network statement sorted. All of those things in place. So now it just means we've ticked off a few really important things. The other aspect of getting the Chinese locomotives going, they've also followed the right process as far as 48 of them is concerned. I saw that. Also with Alstom's involvement, which is a great thing. Now we can get to the real things, which is fixing the network. That is critically important, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There, it doesn't help, and I think that's probably the biggest problem at the moment. We now might get the trains going, They're working on the people, they're working on motivation, they're working on things like that. So what's missing is we still don't have a network in the condition that we want it to be. I know there's pieces that they're doing hard work on, and that's great. But in general, the whole network of South Africa, we've not completely solved the problem yet about how we're going to put money into it. And part of the problem there is Transnet. It's Transnet, not Transnet in terms of its leadership, not at all. It's Transnet in terms of the gestalt of Transnet as a being. It's just having 140 billion rands worth of debt, and it just makes it extremely difficult. It needs to be unbundled. If we can unbundle Transnet effectively and then find the right modalities to fix the network, we're going to get this solved. And I also know that we have a minister that says we will get it solved. So I'm very positive as far as that is concerned.
Professor Jan Havenga, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Strong recommendation there that Transnet be unbundled. Professor Havenga is a Professor of Logistics at the University of Stellenbosch, Director of the Gain Group.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, confirmation in the last 24 hours, a panel of economists are expecting the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee to cut interest rates by 25 basis points on Thursday. We are in a rate-cutting cycle, but geopolitics could well change that. It does come amid some evidence that house prices in Joburg are beginning to rise again very slowly, and that's also despite the state of Joburg at the moment. And as you know, house prices in Joburg haven't moved for about 10 years. Herschel Javits is the CEO of Javits Properties. Herschel, good evening. Thank you for your time. We've had interest rates coming down slightly already. If we get that cut on Thursday, are things going to really start to move?
Thanks, Stephen, for having me on the show. So I think we've certainly already starting to see some shift in buyer demand and activity in the market, based on a couple of factors. Number one, as you've mentioned, we're at the beginning of the interest rate cutting cycle, but I think we're seeing a general shift in sentiment. I think the GNU has been positive. I think load shedding, obviously the interest rate cycle, petrol prices have come down. They might tick marginally up. So there's been a lot more good news than bad news. And I think for the first time in some time, consumers and home buyers are lifting their heads and saying, maybe we can take a longer term view of the market. And the prices, as you mentioned, at which you can get into the residential market in Johannesburg are almost unprecedented.
Unprecedented. In other words, it's great for first-time buyers. And they may also have been contemplating their futures, looking around the rest of the world and thinking, we'll stay here, thanks.
Yeah, I think so. I think the southern tip of Africa is probably a fairly good place to be at the moment in terms of, as you said, the geopolitics. That's not my specialty, but I think we do. We have lots of good signals, relative stability, and if you're willing to take the risk of optimism in Johannesburg for its challenges, there is incredible value, and as long as you're taking a long-term view.
I would imagine one of the things we're going to see in Joburg is that some areas are, how do I put this, weathering the lack of governance by the council. And as a person who lives in Joburg, I think I'm allowed to say that, and I can certainly show you plenty of evidence to say that. But some areas are able to weather it better than others. That's often because they have a lot more money. They had more money invested beforehand. They have particularly active residential organizations. They've boomed themselves off. They have a sort of anchor tenant, a big company in the area, things like that. I would imagine that we're likely to see some properties that in the past would have, fetched a fortune, just happening to be in the wrong area and going for a song, whereas others, we're going to, basically what I'm trying to get to is we're going to see a lot more differential in prices in Joburg suburbs, depending on how they're weathering the storm of a lack of governance.
I think to some degree, Stephen, I mean, what we have seen more conclusively, yes, there might be factors such as security and gated suburbs and that's sort of impacted by affluence, but infrastructure, potholes, bad roads, traffic lights not working, very few suburbs, even the more affluent, expensive suburbs aren't immune to it. And the decline in property prices in Johannesburg over the last couple of years, both in nominal and real terms, has been across the board, maybe to a greater or a lesser degree. As the market starts to turn and demand starts to increase, whether it be sentiment or interest rate based, you might see some suburbs and home values recovering. But the more I look at the differential between Johannesburg and Cape Town, the more I believe it's not about sea views and mountain views and lifestyle. It's about infrastructure, and it's about the ability of local council to deliver to their residents.
Well, we do need to talk about Cape Town, and presumably, if there is another interest rate cut, demand there will continue and continue strongly.
Yeah, I mean, the demand is much healthier in Cape Town for obvious reasons. People coming into the province, and at the top end of the market, obviously less interest rate driven, more confidence driven. And already those prices are accelerating at a faster rate than in Johannesburg. So, for example, when you're semigrating, what you lose here in a soft market, you're going to potentially make up by moving down to the Cape in a slightly softer market. But we will see a great acceleration of property prices as sentiment and the financial impact of rates continue to improve.
Sentiment is such a complicated thing. I mean, the interest rates are something you can point to and say, yes, this is a reason why people will buy, they've got more money. But sentiment's much harder. I mean, if there's a big fight over NHI and the National Coalition doesn't look like it's going to last, if tariffs come back and interest rates, maybe the interest rate cutting cycle stops because of what the person in the White House is doing, things like that. All of this could change, I mean, literally in a month from now. That's kind of how quickly things are moving at the moment. And that is bad for people who are making long-term decisions about where they're going to bring up their families.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, sentiment, confidence is fragile. But I think just generally, we've seen more sustainable good news around all the factors we've spoken about before. And I think that sentiment and confidence is also based on not only what happens now, but the expectation that things will improve and people's financial situation will improve. So it is fickle. It can turn on a dime. But I think the more sustained the positive sentiment is and the impact of that, the more people will take a longer term view.
Thank you very much indeed. Herschel Javits is the CEO at Javits Properties. Well, I don't know how you feel about contemplating property at the moment. Be good to hear from you on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Are you someone who wouldn't touch Joburg with a barge pole? Or is this the moment to plunge in, take the dive, and get something for a song?
The Money Show.
The Markets.
Anthony Modasani is a senior equity sales trader at Absa CIB. Anthony, good evening. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in to our studio. So more retail groups reporting. Woolworths, ShopRite today. There seems to be no end to the growth for the 60/60 app by ShopRite, but their sales, their store growth is slowing down a little bit in the second half.
Yes, Stephen, thanks for having me. Always good to be here. I think it's probably also just over the December period, expanding over that period is never really a good time for obvious reasons. But 60/60, phenomenal, right? I mean, just continues to really deliver and do well. And I mean, if you're in and around Joburg over that period, those guys didn't stop. They were up and down all over the show. So a solid set of results. I mean, I think if you recall last week, what I said is there was quite a bit of a sell bias in the market, just given the sector re-rating we had in December. The trend was sort of like a down 2 or 3 depending on what the numbers did. And for ShopRite was the exception to the rule, right? They came in, the stock held up pretty well. It closed up 1.5%, so a solid performance by them.
I mean, Woolworths finding that their food sales, have been doing, I say always do well. I mean, that's nearly correct. It's been so strong for such a long time. Yeah. But their apparel, their clothing, battling a little bit both here and in Australasia.
No, exactly. Well, so Country Road was slightly not as bad as sort of what we were expecting, and also sort of in line with what the market was expecting, but still not a pretty picture there. And then I was quite surprised by Fashion Beauty and Home that it came in a little bit softer than that. It seemed to have done pretty well last year, and re-rated quite nicely. I think the change in the fashion lines that were in the stores, that was sort of encouraging, and they could move product quite nicely. But I think that's what disappointed the market a bit. It was down 5%, but you saw it actually recover quite well. And, that's sort of something I'd like to just touch on quickly, is just how sentiment sort of shifted a little bit, and it feels like, okay, well, the sector's perhaps pulled back enough. You've had quite a few results roll in now, and it's come to levels where the appetite starting to increase a bit.
Mr. Price were up quite strongly today.
Yes, solid performance from them. I think it was up 3% and a bit on the trading session there. So it's just starting to find a level. We're waiting for Truworths. We do know they like to do a sneaky aftermarket update every now and again, so we'll keep an eye out for that. And then you've got Pick and Pay and Spar that are only going to be sort of in February around, but we've got the bulk of them, and I think Pepco's probably the only other one that we've got to sort of look out for as well.
Tiger Brand selling their Chilean operation, 4.4 billion rand. They want to prioritize South Africa. Another story of a South African company going overseas and coming back.
Well, you know what? It's best. Local is like, right? Stay home and stay in the markets where you know best. Look, it was a very good. It's really encouraging to see from them, right? They've made good money from it. It's not surprising. They did say that they were going to divest from some of their businesses there. So it was a 24% stake, I believe, in Karozi, which was a food manufacturer there. They got about $240 million for it. And they said that in terms of the proceeds, they're redeploying it to their core business towards strategic projects, and once the investments are funded, they'll return money to shareholders. So, who doesn't like to hear that?
And then very quickly, DeepSeek obviously in the US upsetting basically everyone's assumption. US markets trying to recover, but stuttering a bit.
Yeah, very interesting. A friend of mine made a comment to me saying, is it the Temu version of ChatGPT?
Wow.
So, look, it was a very nice, very exciting start to the week. I think it's going to take a while. The market's going to digest it. We've got a couple of tech earnings coming out later part of this week. And you and I discussed the timing around it, which is very interesting. I do think that the US market did sort of need a little bit of a recalibration. We've seen 2 years of just solid outperformance by these tech stocks, right? You got to let the dust settle and just sort of figure out where things are. So, I think S&P's up about 60 odd basis points. Nvidia's up 1.5% now. So it's very interesting. It'll be quite interesting times. And just, I think as investors digest, look, you've got China out for Lunar New Year holidays as well, right? So we've just got to see what happens there. But very interesting times, yeah.
Anthony, thank you. Anthony Wadasani is the senior equity sales trader at Absa CIB.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Don't know how you're feeling about the Joburg housing market tonight. 011-883-0702 021-446-0567. Investment in the future or money down the drain. Your thoughts on that, please. Good to hear from you this evening. Arguments from the Board of Healthcare Funders coming through. They want the Council for Medical Schemes to be forced to allow medical aids to offer cheaper products. Essentially, they'll be offering you cover for certain medical treatments for a relatively low monthly price. But the real story may be the claim, it's being made in court, that the medical aid industry seems to be making, that the council, which is a regulator, is refusing to license these schemes because of the proposed introduction of the National Health Insurance Scheme. We'll speak to Craig Comrie. He's chair of the Health Funders Association in a moment. But first, let's hear the view of Martin Versfeld. He's a partner at Weber Wenzel, specializing in health. Martin, good evening. There's a lot going on here. It's quite a technical area as well. There are other actors than the regulator and the medical aid schemes. But how important is this claim that the regulator, the council, is not behaving in a neutral manner? It's quite a claim to make.
Yes, Stephen. Firstly, thanks very much for inviting me onto your show. It's always good to be on the Money Show, and greetings to all your listeners. It's a claim that can be made. As whether it can be sustained is a different matter. What we do know, and not only insofar as our dealings with the Council for Medical Schemes is concerned, but frankly our dealings with also the Competition Authority, is there's a general reluctance to engage in alternative options for the purposes of trying to ensure that a greater percentage of our South African population can be assisted by the private sector. And of course, I think there's good reason there for parties to start to suspect that finding alternative solutions would in fact be politically inconvenient and would stand potentially in the way of NHI. For example, as I understand the position, at least it's alleged by BHF that their lower cost benefit options could potentially open the door to as many as 10 million additional beneficiaries. To put that in perspective, That's more than the total number of beneficiaries that are currently covered by medical aids. And that means that you'd have 10 million individuals who might equally have a reason not to want to adopt NHI. So I certainly associate myself with the potential political inconvenience. And in my experience when dealing with regulators, there is this ongoing suggestion that NHI is in the wings and they don't want to do anything that might disrupt the prospect of that becoming a reality. Of course, what we also know is that NHI is not going to be with us for many years to come.
Indeed. There are other aspects to this. So the council, as I understand it, goes through quite a long process before just allowing a new section of products or a new category or something like this that we're talking about.
Correct.
And that process involves the National Department of Health. Now, can the National Department of Health just say, no, we don't want this? I mean, do they have the power to do that?
I'm not sure that they necessarily have the power, but they certainly do engage with the National Department of Health. Particularly, I think what we're really talking about here is the question of prescribed minimum benefits. And this is the touch point for this application, which is to say that for many years, and for good reason, to be honest, schemes have the number of benefits that schemes are required to reimburse fully for. I think there's 270 odd conditions and 26 chronic conditions that they have to reimburse for when it comes to a member of a medical scheme. And that's to ensure that members of medical schemes are not short-served by other schemes, irrespective of the benefit option that's selected. So there's good reason for that. But now when we're faced with a situation where it might be said, well, provided if we look potentially at some form of cap, when it comes to PNBs, and I know that that's something that most schemes have frankly been pressing for, and we therefore limit the exposure of schemes when it comes to how much they have to reimburse for, which is currently open-ended. What you do is you open the universe of benefits that could be offered and potentially reduce costs to schemes, and you increase the number of individuals that can participate. So, for me, I think that this is really what the focus of the BHF application is. Whether the Department of Health, the extent to which the department can naysay, I think the Council for Medical Schemes is a creature of statute in its own right. It has its own discretion. And as far as I'm aware, but I stand to be corrected, they might consult with the National Department of Health, and they might be significantly influenced by them, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily for the department to regulate, for example, what conditions are, for example, treated as a PMB and not.
Martin Vesveld, thank you so much. Partner at Webb Wenzel, specializing in health. Listening to that, Craig Comrie, chair of the Health Funders Association. It's, in a way, they, I suppose, compete with the Board for Medical Funders. They include other medical schemes like Discovery. Craig Comrie is also the CEO at Prof Med. Craig, good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. You're not a part of this case, but you support the main intent of the Board of Healthcare Funders. Why do you believe they're doing the right thing?
Well, I think at the core of the whole conversation is trying to make sure that medical scheme cover is more affordable and that we can give more people access to that cover. And it's interesting that alongside the NHI agenda and debates that are ongoing, that the regulations or the framework that the Council's been speaking of regarding low-cost benefit options has been in the pipeline since as early as low-income medical schemes were mooted at the end of 2009. So we've waited an immense amount of time to see regulations relating to the possible introduction of low-cost benefit options for medical schemes. And in the interim, we have seen a perpetuation of exempt health insurance options, which are for-profit options offered by many of the insurers, actually offering what looks like a low-cost benefit option. So it's interesting to know that PMB legislation keeps schemes from actually competing in that access space, and schemes are non-for-profit. They are owned by members, and so it's a strange place to be. But when you start to put together, I guess you connect the dots, you start to see the difference between the fact that the council is subject to and appointed by the Minister of Health, so there is the linkage, and there's no doubt that that low-cost benefit options will compete with those primary care packages that will probably be the starting point of benefits in the NHI. So I absolutely agree with Martin. The council themselves have the opportunity to exempt medical schemes. They have all the power to do it. But the very fact that they're consulting with the Minister of Health gives you an idea that they don't want to be in conflict with the NHI agenda.
The issue of prescribed minimum benefits, I mean, that's really what makes the maths very difficult here. So obviously that issue would have to be resolved first. I mean, from what you say, that's being used to prevent you from competing against insurers, and thus unfairly, it would seem unlikely that that's going to change anytime soon, though.
Well, we've seen that those insurers have been exempted, and every time that the exemption is extended, and that's been since 2017. So every second year, those exemptions get extended for those insurers not to cover PMBs. So that's what the exemption is for. It's in anticipation of a low-cost benefit option framework being available in medical schemes. And so we've just seen that continue for the last few years, certainly unfair in terms of competition and needs a change going forward. And so you can understand exactly where the BHF court case is heading, is to say you need to equalize the playing field. Plus, would you not prefer a for-profit business not to be doing medical schemes and rather the non-profit business actually covering these type of things? Certainly it'll become more affordable if you don't have to pay shareholders. And so that's part of the conversation. PMBs in itself, at the moment, pricing from our independent actuaries, price them at $1,500 per beneficiary, so per individual per month. While you would see the exempted products run from anywhere between $300 all the way through to what looks like a medical scheme's premium. And so that's really the intent, is to make sure that the regulations change to allow proper competition and to allow for a broader access into the market space.
I have to ask, Craig, why didn't you join the case, if that's how you feel?
Yeah, at the time we had been looking at all the implications. So as we indicated, the intent is correct. The manner and some of the additional items that the BHF have in their case, we aren't in agreement with, and so there are some differences in terms of some of the other issues there.
Craig Comrie, thank you very much indeed. Chair of the Health Funders Association and CEO at ProfMed. Well, look, I don't know how you feel about your medical aid. It would seem, on balance, better to have more people being covered than not. I mean, that's kind of one of the great concerns at the moment. The whole point of the NHI is to bring down the cost of health care. But still, people get very concerned about it. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Good to hear from you this evening. Well, you know how important the food industry is to the small business sector. Entries are now open for the Makers Landing Entrepreneur Program. It's part of the V&A Waterfront in Cape Town. They're essentially offering to help incubate companies run by food entrepreneurs. Alex Kabelin is a V&A Waterfront retail executive. Alex, good evening to you. What kind of competition, what kind of program are you running?
Yeah, thanks for having us on the show, Stephen. It's kind of an extension of our shared values approach to small businesses. I think, the Waterfront's goal is still to build an inclusive neighborhood, despite the fact that many people see it as all the glitz and glamour. I think people forget that we actually incubate over 450 small businesses here. So this is a program that focuses specifically on supporting and developing and particularly scaling food entrepreneurs from historically disadvantaged groups and providing them with skills development and access to market opportunities. And we're now in our kind of sixth cohort and looking for applications which are closing very, very shortly. So just putting a final call out and seeing if we can get some more people to join.
What kind of help do you give companies? I mean, when you incubate them, what are you able to do to help?
I think we provide them with a number of items. Many of them are great cooks already, but it's harder to convert them into sustainable businesses and grow jobs. So I think one of the big things is providing them with mentorship and coaching and understanding where they are on the system and helping with that. And particularly it's the scalability. I think that's what we're trying to do. Somebody who's got maybe a side hustle or a smaller business of making 100 kind of products, whatever they may be, samosas or anything. And we want to scale that to 1,000 and 10,000 and give them that ability to get there. I think we've also got state-of-the-art equipment here at the waterfront where we've invested into the capital of that equipment, and they can access that through this incubation program, and then even at a fraction of the cost on almost like a gym membership basis. So, and then wherever we can, we try and connect people with market opportunities and access to markets. So trying to get offtake agreements for them, trying to find opportunities for them to have a new place to test their market and grow further from there.
Alex Kabelin, thank you very much indeed. V&A Waterfront Retail Executive. Nolfa Miller is the founder of Seed Up Jams, one of the companies that's been involved in this. Nolfa, good evening to you.
Good evening, Stephen. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. You've been through this program. How important was it for you and for your company?
Hi, yes, definitely. It was a one-year program that I did with Makers Landing. It is absolutely crucial. If you have... like Mr. Alex was saying, if you have like a side hustle or small business, it is so important to get in touch with the right mentors that can help you scale your business, help you refine your recipe, because we went through product development, we went through health and safety, which is so important. And the most important, I would say, costing. Because as a small business, you are so desperate to make that sale, to sell off your product, but actually, you so many times you're at a loss. So products like these, programs like these, that offers you the platform to come in and go from A to Z. How to open a business bank account in terms of your papers that you need to run the business, COA certification, health and safety certification, all of those that is so important. We don't normally have those things in place. And that is why we can't scale our business. That is why we can't get our product into retail or anything like that. So for anyone out there that is really having a startup business that is running for at least a year or two, where you can now identify and say, this is what I need help with. This is where I want my product to be. Definitely sign up for Makers Landing before Friday.
And Nolfa, I mean, your company now, compared to where it was, I mean, clearly scale's a big thing. I presume you're selling a lot more. You feeling that you can stand on your own 2 feet now?
Yes, definitely. I'm feeling stronger. I'm feeling confident. Before, I used to only do farmers market. I used to do mosque market. I used to do small markets. But since I've joined the program, I can now actually sell my product. And currently, I'm selling my jams to one of the nicest hotels in Cape Town, which is the Peninsula Hotel in Sea Point. And I'm also placed myself into bakeries and other shops. So definitely hats off to Makers Landing for giving me that stepping stone and the confidence and the right mentors, because they were around the clock available. If you stumble across, like, I need to scale my business, for instance. How do I price my business so that another business can still make a profit? You're definitely in the best hands.
Thank you very much indeed. Nolfa Miller, the founder of Seed Up Jams, and Alex Kabelin is the V&A Waterfront Retail Executive.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, still interested in your views on Joburg property at the moment, and we were talking to Herschel Javits a little earlier about that. Seems to be some movement. Bargains, certainly, you would think, for bargain hunters at the moment. In a moment, we'll be talking a bit more about what's been happening around artificial intelligence. The story just a few days ago was, what impact would Donald Trump have as president of the US on the tech industry? Now I don't know if he's going to be that important at all, simply because it seems the story has frankly changed. And now it's really all about what's happening in China. It just shows you how quickly the space is moving. We'll be focusing on that in a little while. And then don't forget, Warren Ingram is going to bring you one of the big debates of our times. Should you have a stock market index, or should you invest with the professionals and get them to manage your money? He's a brave man, Warren Ingram. You're with The Money Show. Good evening.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of The Money Show. I'm Stephen Grootes. So much to talk about, of course, around what's been happening in the US and particularly around artificial intelligence. And it's one of those stories, the moment you see it on one of the wire services, you think to yourself, This is going to be the story of the week. The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, by the way, is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. And when you have a story of the week like that, you know then that this is something you're going to have to focus a lot of time and attention on, and so we will. We'll talk about it more in just a moment. You know, one of the great arguments, debates, people speak with such passion, and they're all kind of analyst-type people, if you know what I mean, but they talk with such passion about this, which is it better to just put your money into the stock market, all of it, and track the index, or is it better to actually pay someone to manage your money for you? Well, we'll find out a bit more about that debate, and it goes back many years, and there are lots of arguments in both directions around it. Warren Ingram, that's going to be your focus on personal finance this evening. Looking forward to that as well. He'll take your calls too. So good to hear from you. 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Don't forget, in a few moments, you will hear from Rotende Hundungi as well. He'll update us on some of the big business stories from our continent.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Well, most markets around the world being driven at the moment by the response to the release of the Chinese AI model DeepSeek. I mean, you already know NVIDIA slid 17% yesterday. And it's possibly the first big sort of reverse of the trend of the last few months that has seen capital being sucked into the US and primarily into tech stocks. Well, all of this comes as Donald Trump starts his second term as US president, and he's promised to ensure that the US keeps its lead over China in AI, promised big investments. I think it's called Stargate or something like that is going to be involved in all of this. Chetan Ramlall is the head of quantitative research at STANLIB. Chetan, good evening to you and thanks for your time. This space has changed so quickly over just the last 36 hours. I mean, up until Friday, we thought the biggest variable in what might happen with AI was probably Trump's policies. That seems to have all changed.
Yeah, good evening, Stephen. Thank you for having me. I mean, it's been an absolutely fascinating last couple of days. I think the developments have really, I sort of use the term, thrown the cat amongst the pigeons. And I think sort of Trump coming into his second term of power wasn't expecting this, and sort of being very pro the US and pro AI policy. I think this really came out of left field. So very, very fascinating indeed. So
a chaotic last couple of days. There's still opportunities for investors here, and I mean, I presume they must be somewhere.
Yeah, most certainly, Stephen. I think it's so important. It's so important to always focus on the long term. And I say this because if you look at what's happening with the tech space in particular, a lot of the changes that we are seeing have sort of moved out of the realm of just being buzzwords and actually taking structural effect and structural changes in society. And I think if you sort of put a 5 to 10 year hat and even beyond that, it's very hard to argue for or argue against the value of tech, especially in a portfolio. And also, I think if you think of what it means for society, and then obviously the investment case is still very strong.
I suppose the question is, where do you put it? If you can have a surprise like this, then you can have a surprise like this again.
It's possible, and I think it's always tricky because a lot of the space is so new and it's developing and evolving so rapidly. But I think if you look at what the US has and a lot of the tech giants which have been leading the race in the US, it's also very hard to argue against them in the short term and bet against them because there's a level of maturity that has come about. And I think it's that maturity that will carry a lot of these companies. And the strides that they've made are fantastic. Now, I think one has to still be cautious. There will be new entrants, which I think overall is good for competition. It definitely will get the prices down. It gets more creativity into the market. But I think as with all things, there will be the risk of new entrants and new people in the space, but the US is still very much at the forefront.
How important is the role of President Trump in all of this? I mean, as you say, the US has a deep history of innovation. Was regulation standing in the way of any of that? I mean, that's the big thing that he's against, regulation.
Yeah, I think that this topic of regulation is such an important idea that's going around at the moment in the space. So obviously Trump is very much pro-AI, pro-development, pro-technology. In fact, he's even repealed some of the Biden administration's regulations in the space. But I think one has to obviously balance the rate of innovation and change and also safety. So I think there is a balancing act between the two. But no doubt, I think with Trump at the helm, it's definitely going to bolster tech stocks and AI companies in general. I think Trump is going to do whatever he can to make sure that the U.S. wins, that the U.S. stays at the forefront. He is very much pro-America and pro-U.S. So I think if you look at his stance on tariffs, making it difficult for China, the way he wants to deregulate and not let the sort of roadblocks stop innovation, I think overall Trump is going to do whatever he can to make sure the U.S. stays on top.
Can governments actually do that much? I mean, things are moving so quickly. I don't know if they can.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating, because, of course, you need the government's involvement. You need the support of the government. You mentioned earlier on in the introduction Project Stargate, which Trump himself spoke about. This is going to be a massive, upwards of $500 billion, and this will be a joint venture from the private sector that will be putting this amount of capital into the AI space in America. And this is going to cover things from energy, from storage facilities to data centers. So it's a massive, widespread project that Trump has said he wants to make the U.S. AI ready and almost start from grassroots level all the way to a mature phase and really be the leaders in the space. So I think government backing has to be there. But again, it's very difficult because innovation is happening so quickly that even regulation can't keep up with it. So really fascinating, really fascinating.
It does seem, and we got some analysis on this yesterday, but it really does seem to be only a US versus China. I mean, there's really no one else in this space.
And again, it does seem to be that way. I think they, at least if you look at the US first, they were really leading the charge in this race. But of course, China can't be written out, and these two countries definitely dominate the headlines. But I would still say a word of caution, just as how DeepSeek sort of came out of the blue and came out of left field from China. I think don't discount other very tech-savvy and strong countries. I think there's talks of projects underway in India, even in the European Union. There's certain startups which are doing some very fascinating work in the space. And to your earlier point, be prepared for surprises, because I think they will come. And that's the nature of the rate of innovation, I think.
There are other factors, there are other things. This is all taking part in a much greater context. I mean, one of the reasons that Trump wants to do this, and I suppose you could probably say, or you make the argument that one of the reasons China has poured so many resources into artificial intelligence too, is because of the sheer rivalry between these two nations. Something else could come along that's a sort of hot point between the two of them. And perhaps there's a tariff war or a trade war between the two of them or something. And that could, on the one side, intensify this competition. It does also stop cooperation. I mean, I realize a lot of these academic papers from the Chinese side have been, been sort of very open. This is an open source model that's been released. And the US academic papers have, as I understand it, been studied by the Chinese very carefully. What I'm trying to get to is, there are better ways to do artificial intelligence. We shouldn't have to sit back as South Africans and watch the US and China fight it out like this.
Well, it's such an important point to make, Stephen, because we really do live in a very fascinating time and a very, I would say, empowered time because of the internet. And a lot of the papers, a lot of the resources you've mentioned are actually accessible to all of us. And by no means we as South Africans should just sit back and let this sort of feel like it's out of our hands. And I must say, in all credit, there are a lot of great companies and great players in the space locally who are starting to look at these technologies. I can speak from a financial services perspective, and then even cross-sector from the engineering companies and even healthcare and so forth. I think AI has a massive impact locally, and there are a lot of skilled people looking at this. And like you said, I think the risk with the US and China, there's always that, it's always sort of simmering, and there always could be an escalation in tensions. Trump, by his nature, will probably fuel some of this because he's so America first. But I always will say that I think competition is good. It forces innovation. It keeps the dial ticking. And I think for us as South Africans, if we bring it locally, we shouldn't be left behind. So stay abreast of what's going on and find ways in whatever niche you are in to stay skilled and up to date.
This is a ridiculous question to ask you, Chetan, but I mean, what happens next? I mean, you'd think maybe what happens is that NVIDIA's share price starts to recover, that the Magnificent Seven, because they've got so much investment tied into this, that people start to look at their, balance sheets, and that would be the first move until the next kind of shock, or someone will, move up the date for an AI model they were going to release, and they'll happen to be American, and then Trump will claim victory.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's again, I think everyone was sort of caught by this announcement. And naturally, if you look at sort of what the markets have gone through, it's been a bit of a rout the last couple of days. I mean, NVIDIA, I think they wiped off close to $600 billion, which is almost double the GDP of South Africa in one day. So just for the context of that reaction. But I think when you look at markets do react very drastically in the short term. And specifically in NVIDIA, I think there's no reason to panic completely. I think it was more shock. Their chips are used in almost all applications. They still have a huge base that countries around the world are still using their hardware. So I don't think there's any immediate risk of to panic. But I think naturally, I think with time it will play out and you'll sort of see that value come through. And if DeepSeek can follow up with something revolutionary, then naturally the markets will react again.
Chetan, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Chetan Ramlall is the head of quantitative research at STANLIB.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
Well, let's find out what's happening on our continent now. Some of the bigger business stories. Dr. Rotendo Ndwingi is the founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory and author of Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Rotendo, good evening. Always good to see you.
Oh, good to see you, Steve.
Qatar Airways and Rwanda Air, they're closing in on a deal. There's a fascinating little hub that's growing in East Africa there.
Very competitive hub, Stephen. And, it's this deal, President Kagame with Rwanda. We know President Kagame is very entrepreneurial, if you can say that of a president. But just to give you some context in terms of why it's competitive in that region, and I'll obviously unpack a bit more in terms of three key areas that deal is going to. Firstly, I mean, that East African area, you remember Ethiopia has just invested big time in terms of building and up-ramping their airport, which is probably going to be the largest one in Africa, close to OR Tambo in South Africa. Kenya Airlines is also listed on the Kenyan Stock Exchange. So that's another big investment. So you've got three big players in that space, and they're seeing the opportunity, and they're seeing the opportunity to expand and be strategic in Africa, which is a great thing. But if you look at this specific deal, the estimated value of the investment is about $1.3 billion, Steve. And it's Rwanda Air, and it will consist of Qatar partnering with Rwanda. They will own plus or minus 49% stake in Rwanda Air and 60% stake in their new Bulgaria International Airport. So that's quite a significant chunk of your local aviation space that you're giving to Qatar. The second big thing about this deal is that Qatar itself wants to strengthen its footprint on the African continent. If you recall, recently they made another 25% stake in buying out a South African airline called Airlink. So that was another strategic move. And the third thing about this deal and it's part of Qatar's strategy in terms of the hub and spoke perspective with regards to wanting to actually build another cargo hub outside Qatar and to be their first one outside Qatar. So they've been very intentional. Rwanda is obviously embracing this. I've been to Ethiopia, Kenya, and Rwanda, all airports, doing business there. And I can tell you that every time you go there, you get impressed in terms of the commitment, the heart for excellence, and the passion to actually expand their brand. So it's going to be interesting. And another big thing, remember Boeing, a US big multinational, has moved its head office from South Africa all the way to Ethiopia. So again, another big player investing in that region. So it's going to be exciting to see what's going to happen in the next few years in that space.
It's fascinating how Middle Eastern countries, and particularly Qatar Airways, are really interested in African airspace at the moment, and they're making a big bet on the future.
Yeah, it is. And part of me is also, remember, if we look at the bigger geoeconomics playing globally, I mean, and you've talked to it before in terms of what's happening in the African space, obviously the dilemma between China and the US, the East versus the West. And if you think about it, Qatar is more on the east in terms of location. I'm talking about the Middle East. And they are probably seeing the traffic as well coming from the east, coming into Africa, of goods and people. So understandably, if they're playing a long-term game, if they're playing a strategic game, and I think it just talks to the fact that sometimes we underestimate it, but Africa as a continent, albeit that there are all these other challenges, there's huge opportunity. And these first world countries or these advanced countries that have got the cash are willing to invest if they see the good deals, if they partner up with the government in the right way. And it's just another confirmation in terms of the positive side of Africa, albeit all these other challenges that exist.
I mean, aligned to that, the United Arab Emirates is now the leading investor in Africa. Again, another Middle Eastern country. Very interesting that they're trying to basically, put as much money as they can, and they're hoping to reap the reward. Yeah,
it talks quite nicely to that. I mean, I think there are about 6 significant deals. But before I go into that, just from the period 2019 to 2023, the UAE has invested close to $110 billion US dollars on the African continent, and $72 billion of this is focused on renewable energy. The rest of it is in the infrastructure space. Just to give you some big deals and some investments that they've made on the continent. And by the way, Stephen, they've actually surpassed UK, China, and the USA in terms of investments on the African continent. So the UAE or the Middle East, and I'm just talking UAE, this Saudi Arabia, there's Qatar, there are all those other Emirates, they don't make a lot of noise, but when they do invest, they do it seriously because they've got the oil money to back it up. But 6 key deals that come out, DP1, which is a big player on the ports, there's 6 ports on the African continent. Abu Dhabi Ports holds about 6 concessional rights in Guinea, Egypt, Angola, and DRC. Another big investment is by the International Resource Holding Company, which has a 51% stake in the Zambia Mopani copper mines. And in Mauritania, there's a 34 billion green hydrogen project that has been invested by the UAE. And then another big solar project for about $2 billion US dollars. So all of these, just talking again to the opportunity these big corporates from the UAE are seeing in Africa. I was actually reading another article, Stephen, and they estimate there are about 21,000 companies from Africa headquartered in the Middle East in one way or the other. So there's an interesting collaboration happening between ourselves and the Middle East. And but over and above this, there are growing rumors. It's still to be confirmed with regards to, although the investment is coming in, and we've seen this with the Chinese, in terms of breaches with regards to labor and environmental concerns. And that's always a big concern because we love the money in Africa, but we also want to make sure that our people are kept first and foremost in the right conditions.
And they could hand the Guptas back to the UAE. Wouldn't mind if they did that. That would be nice. That would prove that we can trust them. EcoBank joining they're driving ACTFA through empowering SMEs. And this, of course, is about the free trade area across Africa.
Yeah, so, I mean, we all know with I was actually doing a talk recently with the AFCFTA, a big drive, the increase in Africa's income, if AFCFTA achieves its 2030 goals, is like $450 billion US dollars. Intra-Africa exports are supposed to increase by 81%, and the continent's GDP is to increase by 7%. So these are all stats, but obviously I believe we're moving in the right direction. But where does EcoBank come into play with you? EcoBank, headquartered, a Pan-African bank headquartered in Togo, is operating in about 35 countries, Stephen, on the African continent, and is about 30 million customers. So quite an expansive bank in terms of what it has achieved, and they've intentionally positioned themselves to help in terms of the AFCFTA by driving the SME space, and they've done this through a facility called the Market Trade Hub, which is a platform that basically has got certain functionalities that support this. One of the key things that, because it's technology based, it easily makes between importers and exporters, which is great, because I think one of the challenges that we have with SMEs, Stephen, and just to give some key stats about the SME space in the African market, because people don't really appreciate the quantum of the SME space on the African market. We've probably got about 40 million SMEs in Africa, and 50% of them lack access to credit. And that's the enterprise market of SMEs accounts for 90% of the business in Africa, just in terms of units, not in terms of value of business. And then 60% of the workforce is placed in the SME space. And most of that sits in the sub-Saharan space or sub-Saharan Africa. So why I'm highlighting all of this is that there's a huge volume the value in terms of return on investment is small, but if we trigger and invest and help them scale up, the contribution to industrialization on the African continent is quite significant. And that's why EcoBank, obviously being a bank with a strategic footprint, they've created what they call the EcoBank Market Trade Hub that allows for SMEs to be able to match importers and exporters, which is always a big relief. The second thing is that it opens up SME traders to have access to their own database of services that EcoBank provides, which is always great. If you're an SME, what's the biggest challenge? You have access to capital. And that's the third thing. By partnering up with African Bank, which has got another system, I think it's called Mansa, that's a due diligence system. It allows SMEs to be able to get credit, but not only do they get credit, but they also get access to the platforms that both EcoBank and African Bank have. So it's a great initiative and will make a huge difference in terms of driving growth on the African market. The only challenge, obviously, is that it's easier said than done. And entrepreneurs, and to be able to give them the discipline, that's still to be seen. But I think it's a huge opportunity there, Steve.
Sure. No, very interesting. And then, have I read this right? Rugby school. This is the British school rugby. Is that right? In Rugby, the town.
It's rugby. So for those who are not too familiar, obviously rugby is a sport, we know it. But how did rugby start? And if you know your history, Stephen, about 200 years ago, there was a young boy playing soccer with his friends in England at a school called Rugby by the name of Webb Ellis. And in the middle of the soccer game, he picked up the ball and then he began running. And out of that, rugby was invented. And the school was called Rugby, which was named to the sport. And the trophy, which we proudly as South Africa have had for the last 3 times, is the Webb Ellis Trophy. Now, how does this all tie back to Nigeria, which is not a rugby school, or is not a rugby country?
There's lots of rugby in Nigeria, though.
No, there is a lot of rugby in Nigeria. But I think what sticks out is rugby, which is obviously a private school in the UK, very prestigious, a high school, in fact, has opened up a branch in Nigeria, specifically at the Eco Atlantic Park. And this Eco Atlantic Park is a $6 billion US dollar investment that has been done in Nigeria. And for those that have been to Nigeria, I've been there. There's the mainland, and then there's the island area, which is called VI. And the Eco Atlantic is the reclamation that has been done with regards putting up land where there was formerly sea. And the advantage of that, it's a significant upmarket place. It's a huge investment in Nigeria. A lot of players are coming into that space. So it's obviously quite significant to have one of the most historically and prestigious schools in Nigeria, in the UK, opening up in this place. And I think what was a bit surprising is historically usually find is the universities that are linking up in Nigeria. You've got, and because we know Nigeria's got huge intellectual capital, so usually your London business schools are there, your Harvards, etc., etc. But in this case, rugby, which is a high school, is intentionally opened up there. The other school that they opened up in, I think, was in Japan and Thailand. So they specifically chose Nigeria. I think the story talks more in terms of the potential and the significance of the investment of that's happening at Eco Atlantic in Nigeria as opposed to the school opening. Will they ever open in South Africa?
Well, they'll lose if they do. I mean...
It might happen, but I doubt with English pride that they will open up a rugby school in South Africa. Maybe when they win the World Cup one day, then they'll do it. But I think the exciting thing about this is, I think it's more in terms of the investment and the kind of different components that it's attracting. And this specifically talks to education, which is something Africa needs and will make a difference. So another great story to follow, and hopefully it will produce great students as well as players from a rugby perspective.
The English can't even keep their medals round their necks. Dr. Rutendo Hundingi, thank you very much indeed. Always good to see you. Founding Director at Tribe Africa Advisory.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Well, I don't know if you've ever come across this debate, but it is one of the more interesting debates that you find in investing. And the argument is around whether or not you should just bet the entire stock market index, or if you should in fact invest with a fund manager who manages your money for you. So if you were, for example, to bet on basically every stock in the JSE, you put money in and the fund will then distribute the money according to a weighting across all of those stocks, and then it rises and falls with the index is one way of doing it. The other is to then actually invest it with fund managers, and they will decide where to put your money. They will make bets on what's going to happen in the future and all the rest. And that's going to be the focus of your conversation with Warren Ingram this evening on personal finance. Just battling to get through to him. We'll have him for you, I understand, in just a moment. And just to essentially continue with this conversation, it is, by the way, in some ways, an incredibly divisive argument. You can imagine people who are paid to manage money, how they feel about this debate. And then, of course, you can imagine people who are the beneficiaries and how they feel about all of this. Warren Ingram with us now. Warren, I suppose we need to start off with the real difference between an index investor and a fund manager. And I suppose one's active and one's not quite not so active.
You're right, Stephen. It's one of those those fiercely held debates now between the industry professionals and the not so new kids on the block anymore, but the index investors. And I think we're probably all a lot more familiar with fund managers. So those would be. And I say it with no sarcasm, very bright, very well educated investment professionals who very focused on doing deep research, understanding what drive markets and particularly what they invest in. In other words, if they're share investors, they will try to understand markets and specifically the companies they want to buy and those they want to avoid. And that would apply to bond investors, property investors, and the like. And they've been doing this job for as an industry for well over 100 years now. And they're typically brands that we would know very well. They advertise at airports, on TV, sponsor, sport and all those kinds of things. And typically very good at marketing, the top ones, and telling their story in a very compelling way. So those would be fund managers. And on the other side of the equation, the slightly newer industry would be companies that decide to offer you a way of buying an entire stock market or as much of a stock market as possible, but doing it with one investment. In other words, you buy the top 40 shares on the JSE, which are generally acknowledged to be the bulk of the value of the stock exchange in South Africa. But instead of going to buy all 40 of them or buying a unit trust that chooses some of the top 40, you buy one index tracker. And what it does is it buys every single one of those 40 shares, and it does it in proportion to their size. In other words, if company A is the biggest company on the stock exchange, it's the most valuable, then that would be the proportion that you would have. You'd have the same proportion in your index tracker right down to the 40th biggest company. And the job of an index manager is to track that index as closely as possible and to do it as cost effectively as possible. And I guess I haven't mentioned the C word until now, but that's the key point here is index trackers are generally at least half the cost and sometimes a tenth or a thousandth of the cost of a fund management equivalent product.
We're talking to Warren Ingram this evening on personal finance, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Your questions for him about your money. Warren, I suppose one of the great things about an index investor is that once it's going, you don't really need to do anything. You can just leave it. You just lose it. You don't have to do anything with it. It'll just chug along.
It will, and I love the analogy. I think it's true. You can fire and forget, and I think the reason that's important is the real job of you and I as people who want to invest our money and want to get to the point of financial freedom is we need to stay invested in stock markets, bond markets, property markets for absolutely as long as possible, and not fall to the temptation of adding a bit extra when everyone else is doing well, or even worse, panicking when everyone else is panicking, and then selling in a kind of a mindless rush to exit the doors. And that unfortunately is repetitive human behavior. We see that in South Africa and everywhere else in the world. So the one thing about an index, you know what you're buying when you buy it. If it's the top 40 again, just to use that as the example, it is what it says on the box. It's the top 40 biggest companies. You buy it. Your job is to keep adding money when you can, and to do that as regularly as you can, and then do everything you can not to sell until such time as you want to draw on that money to fund your life and your cost of living. So it's very much easier to just buy it and carry on. The problem, in contrast with a fund manager, is you do need to do some monitoring, and by all means, don't monitor it every day or every week or potentially even every month, but you will need to keep track of that fund manager. Number one, to understand if there are any changes. Have some of the people left or have new people joined, and what are those new staff like? Are they better than the old lot, or are they worse? What's their experience like? And then, very importantly, are they sticking to what they said when you bought into their approach? In other words, if they say to you, our job is to find the best unloved companies on the stock exchange. In other words, these are the ones that are not popular and not tracked by the markets in general. Then you need to make sure that they're continuing to do that and not suddenly falling prey to the latest investment fashion and buying the most popular company on the exchange. So you've got to make sure that they're sticking to their knitting and making sure that that they're doing what they say they're going to do. And that's particularly important when they're not delivering good returns. So if you buy a fund that says, I'm a global fund and I buy shares that look nothing like tech shares, I'm going to buy companies that are old world manufacturing businesses, then they've probably had a fairly lousy time over the last 4 or 5 years, because pretty much tech has attracted all the money in the world. And so what you don't want to see in a fund like that is suddenly they start buying Apple and Microsoft and Nvidia, because they're not sticking to their knitting. They've changed their whole philosophy. And that's dangerous when a fund manager changes its spots. It's a bit like a leopard. A leopard is a leopard. It's not a lion.
When you talk about that, so one of the things we've seen over the last 24, 36 hours is what's happened to Nvidia, which was the sort of tech industry darling in the US, and they lost 17% of their value. That's over $500 billion. It's just an unbelievable amount of money. How would that affect an index share? So an index investment. So I am presuming if the way those products work is the more expensive a company, the more valuable it is, the more money they put into it, you would have come away yesterday feeling a bit sorry for yourself.
You're right, and it's been the critique of index investing for a very long period of time. It's the fund managers in particular would say that what you're doing is you're chasing yesterday's winners, and using Nvidia as the example, it's the share that's done incredibly well in 2023 and 2024, and it's phenomenally expensive as a share. It's got to make something like 45 years worth of profits to justify the current price, and it's the biggest company around. And so what you're doing, if you're an index investor, is you're buying and holding the thing which has become most expensive. And so when the markets turn and the expensive share, or in this case, they talk about the Magnificent Seven. It's the 7 big tech-related shares have attracted the most money. They are between those 7 and maybe the top 10 shares on the S&P are I think about 35 or 38% of the value of the S&P, or it was on Friday evening, and maybe not so much by now. But at the same time, that's been a criticism of indexes all along. Indices always attract the winners, and they always become the bigger shares in the market. And then this is the criticism. The truth is, Stephen, when you look at an index versus the fund management universe of managers trying to beat the index, they can't do a very good job, these fund managers. In fact, somewhere around 8 out of 10 of them can't beat the index, even with all these obvious flaws of having concentration risk and all these eggs in one basket. And so I almost want to say, yes, you are buying something which has some concentration risk, and that's true. The antidote to that is don't put all your money into the index at once. Make sure that you're doing it in batches, whether it's monthly or every 6 months. That's a great way to smooth out that potential danger. But the prospect of you doing better than 80% of all the other fund managers out there is very real. And I wasn't the best student at school, if someone had said to me, you don't need to study and you're going to get 80% for every exam, I would have taken it. And that's what happens when you buy the index.
Sure. Very interesting way of looking at it. I like that. You don't need to study, you still get 80%. When you have an active fund manager and they, I suppose, would act against an expensive share, they would say, look, you can't put too much into NVIDIA. But up until Friday, every client in the world would have been onto their fund manager saying, buy more NVIDIA. I mean, this is where it gets quite messy.
Yes, and it's certainly been a raging debate because if you're a fund manager that says, I buy growth companies, I buy companies that I believe have a very high potential to grow themselves, their profits and their dividends, etc., then NVIDIA would be a big call. And owning the Magnificent Seven would have been the most important decision. And the temptation for those managers would have been potentially to buy even more than what you would normally find in an index in those shares. So the potential for risk can escalate there. Having said that, there will be a group of fund managers, they're generally called value managers, who would look at that and say, there is no way I can justify paying 45 years worth of profit right now for one share, because that share has to deliver enormous growth year after year after year and deliver perfect performance in perfect conditions all the time. And so, yes, they would have clients that would be unhappy with them when NVIDIA is doing well. But over the last few days, those same clients would probably be breathing a sigh of relief that they've got exposure to value managers. So I think, that, and I don't want to knock fund managers. I actually believe they have a role in the world now. But the trick there is they need to charge fairly for their fees, and they do need to have a very clear mandate and then exhibit discipline around that mandate. And I think value managers, right around the world have been punished because, low interest rates have suited growth companies a lot. And potentially now we're in an environment where interest rates might be high for quite some time, for a few years. And that should be very good for value managers. And we might see, that number of only 2 out of 10 fund managers outperforming. Maybe that starts to increase. And then we start to realize that actually fund managers can do a good job for you, but maybe it shouldn't be one or the other. It might need to be a combination of the two.
Warren Ingram with Personal Finance this evening. He's co-founder of Galileo Capital. And we have a question from Michael Warren. He says, hi, I'm planning to invest a significant inheritance that was recently paid to me. I've tried to do some reading about when to invest because the world seems a little unstable right now and stock markets have been great over the last few years. Should I wait for everything to calm down before I invest? Very interesting question from Michael. We'll have Warren's response in just a moment.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
On the next Money Show, Nkanyezi Makari, the new CEO of Future Nation Schools, joins you as this week's shapeshifter. She's in the coal front of the changing face of education in the country. Richard Mulholland, the founder of Missing Link and Too Many Robots, is the latest news from the world of business unusual. Also, analysis of all of the top business news of the day.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
We had a question for Warren. It was from Michael saying, I'm planning to invest a significant inheritance, but worried about the world looking a little unstable now. Stock markets have been great the last few years. Should I wait for everything to calm down before I invest? Warren, it's a really interesting question. I mean, do you wait or do you always invest now?
It's human nature and almost, intuitively common sense to say, it doesn't make sense to allocate my money to markets when we've still got a huge amount of geopolitical uncertainty in Europe. We've got Donald Trump, who could do anything and will do anything in the next few days, weeks and months. And then you've got, the bugbear of inflation that hasn't really gone away. And if you've got an inheritance that might be life-changing money for you, the temptation to sit on the sidelines and wait for things to calm down and to normalize is very understandable. Unfortunately, Stephen, it's not that easy. It's not that simple, because what you really want to do if you're an investor is you want to be the person that runs into the burning building when everyone else is running out of it, because you've got to buy assets that are at a good price, that offer good value. You don't want to buy things that are already very expensive and priced for perfection. So you're looking for opportunities to get into investment markets, and especially stock markets, when people are most uncertain, when people are most emotionally unstable and most fearful, because that's generally when they would be selling assets at a low price and potentially transferring their share exposure to cash, and they would be sitting on the sidelines waiting for things to get better. And that's the exact time when you want to be allocating more and more of your money into investment markets, because the price you pay for an investment has a huge outcome on or influence on the outcome of your money over a long period of time. So if you buy something that's phenomenally expensive, it can still grow for you over a decade, but the chances of growth are less. Whereas if you buy something that's high quality but very cheap because you bought it when everyone else was panicking, you've given yourself a great chance of getting very good growth over a 5 and 10 year period. So what I do know is we can't time these things. You know, the world might get much more unstable in 3 months' time, or suddenly, great stability returns and everything goes well. So when you're investing your money, you have to be really humble enough to say, I can't forecast what the outcome is going to be of the weather tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen to investment markets over time. And so when you've got a large lump sum and the world is uncertain, I think take your lump sum, divide it into 6 and allocate that into your investment markets in equal proportions over that time. But the one thing you really can't do is sit back and wait for things to get better, because by the time I'm sitting on the show talking to Stephen saying, okay, everything looks good now, the price of all the assets have jumped up already in anticipation of everything being good. So markets look ahead and they respond very quickly to signs of good news, and generally will push prices of assets up far faster than any of us can hope to kind of deploy our cash back into markets. So I don't think you wait. I think you phase in to give yourself some sort of peace of mind, but actually you really want markets to be going down and for the world to be very unstable when you're trying to deploy a large lump sum.
Okay, no, that does make a lot of sense, and you sort of want to almost buy at the right time, which is, I suppose, what you would be doing. It's another way of putting it. The debate between active fund managers and indexes, how do you manage it? In the end, do you have a combination of the two? It's your old phrase, diversify.
Yeah, I think I've made peace with the fact that if I'm going to pay extra money to a fund manager, what I'm hoping for is that I'm going to take some of the money, put it in an index, and then I'm going to take some money and give it to a fund manager. And my hope is that fund manager is going to invest the money in things that are completely different from the index. And the plan there is some form of diversification where you're hoping that you get the returns of markets via the index, but the protection against very expensive sectors of the markets and potentially unexplored opportunities through a fund manager. And then what you're really aiming for is that 1 + 1 gets you to 2 1/4, because we know that there aren't many secrets to the investment world. Investment markets are well researched and monitored all the time, but I do think allocating a chunk, and for me it's about half of my money to an index makes a lot of sense. I will do as well as everybody else in that instance, but then buying fund managers who do things completely differently to the market either gives me some protection when the markets go down because they own the cheaper assets, or it gives me exposure to things that just aren't listed. A lot of very big companies, if we think about SpaceX as an example, they're not even bothering to list anymore. So you need to find other ways to buy into those companies, and sometimes fund managers give you that access.
I suppose the other thing is that you do need to feel comfortable with what you've done.
Yeah. So, if you're someone that's, been listening to the adverts of a particular fund manager for the last 20 or 30 years, and your parents invested with them, and you have a high degree of confidence that they'll do a decent job for you, then all of the arguments about active and passive and choosing this or that doesn't really help if you believe that I'm going to allocate my money to a fund manager I believe in, and most importantly, that I'll stay there for the next decade or two. Because if that gives you confidence and comfort, and you stick to the strategy, that's a much better idea than buying an index because I said so on the radio, and then losing confidence in 3 months' time when the first stock market crash happens and you lose faith. So staying invested really is the key in all of this.
Warren Ingram, thank you so much. Co-founder at Galileo Capital. Really interesting debate, and one that'll continue for quite some time.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
That's it for The Money Show. We're back tomorrow. Still a lot to watch on markets. We'll update you on all of that tomorrow evening. Good evening.